There's a film that just started its theatrical run called Shtetele, and I recently had a chance to go see it. In one sentence, it's an emotional roller coaster. In two sentences, it's this beautiful black and white film that's shot as a one-take in both Yiddish and Ukrainian, and it follows this young man named Mendel who returns to his town in Galicia the day before the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Together with his friend Damian, they cross the walking bridge back into his shtetl, and thus the clock begins on the final hours of that world.
But as he goes into the town, he can't really help himself but talk to all these people from his life, from his community. A lot of the film is that, these discussions that he has with people, trying to navigate his identity, trying to balance his modern mindset and freedom with his connection to his roots.
This is Moshe Lobel, the actor who plays Mendel in this film. And in this episode of Yiddish Kino Club, I'm excited to explore the deeper meaning behind some of the themes in this film, Shtetl. Hi, if you're new here, my name is David, and here on Yiddishkeit, we explore the experience of Jewishness. Personally, I like to do that by exploring Jewish history, culture, and art. This movie is such a great example of all three of these things because not only is it a beautiful piece of cinema which captures a moment in Jewish history, but it also sheds light on how the themes of the shtetl remain relevant over 80 years after the story takes place. In this video, I want to explore two main topics. The first is the big theme of Yiddish film, which this film seamlessly fits into, and that is being between two worlds. The second theme is about the production of this film, particularly the synchronicity behind it. The story in this film takes place in Ukraine on the eve of war, and it was filmed on the eve of the war in Ukraine. The name of this film is Shtetl without the E, and that is because the creator of this film, Adi Walter, was inspired by another French writer named Georges Perec, who wrote this novel called A Void, where he doesn't use the letter E. And this constraint that Perec puts on his novel is symbolic. It represents loss, particularly the people that Perec lost in the war, including his mother who perished at Auschwitz. The whole film is viewed from this perspective of this grand irony that all these ideological differences and disputes seem kind of petty in the face of this impending doom, the end of the world. As we follow Mendel through his town, we get to see this world that was lost, that is symbolically represented by the absence of the letter E. Although the shtetl was an actual place, it's also a concept. It's a microcosm of Jewishness. And so this is the first thing I'm really excited to explore, since I've recently become fascinated with this idea of the symbolism of the shtetl, and I'm really excited that this film gives us an opportunity to explore that. The most famous example of this, I believe, is the musical Fiddler on the Roof, which opens with Tevye breaking the fourth wall and giving us a tour of his fictional shtetl of Anatevka. What he describes is this idea that he thinks of his Jewishness as a man standing on a roof, trying to remain steady without falling.
Without breaking his neck.
And throughout the movie, we get to see this concept play out, where we see how the stability of Tevye's man on the roof is threatened by the tides of modernity which sweep through his world. In Tevye's case, his shtetl was created by Solomon Rabinovich, better known as Shalom Aleichem. It's through his writings that the world was introduced not only to Tevye and his daughters, but to this idea of the push and pull of the shtetl, of trying to remain steady in tradition while adjusting to changing circumstances. It's through Fiddler on the Roof that we get a little taste of this dialectic, this tension between these two worlds. And this is a central theme of this film, Shtetl, as well, which we'll explore in depth in just a moment, but I found it really interesting that there's a very subtle reference to Shalom Aleichem in this movie as well. There's this moment where one of the townsmen refers to the city of Kiev, where Mendel just came from, as Yehupitz, which comes from Shalom Aleicham's writing. It's the Yiddish slang term for that city, which is derived from the word Egypt. And this further underscores this tension between two worlds, where you have the big city, which is very modern, but also oppressive and spiritually devoid, like Egypt, versus the shtetl, which is old and smaller, but cozy, like mini Jerusalem. Just as a side point, when I was growing up, a lot of people would often use the term Yehupitzville to refer to something that was really far away. I don't think anybody knew where that term came from. The fact that they were making a Shalom Aleichem reference, I don't know, it's pretty cool. The character in Fiddler on the Roof who is the most similar to Mendel is Perchik, is also of similar age in the story, comes from the big city, and ends up finding his love interest in the shtetl. With Perchik, his story is playing out at the turn of the 20th century, and so communism is still a debated topic, while this film shows us Mendel's story in 1941. And at this point, over 2 decades into the existence of the Soviet Union, not only does communism control a large part of Europe, but is about to go to war with Nazi Germany. The brief history behind this is that in 1939, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany signed an agreement that they're not going to fight each other and to essentially split up all the lands in between them. And this is known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And a few weeks later, in September, Nazi Germany invades Poland, starting World War II. And a few weeks after that, Soviet Russia invades the rest of Poland, and they eventually split all that land up. And for the next 2 years or so, the situation in this area of Eastern Poland remains relatively stable compared to Western Poland and gets incorporated into the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. And so it's into this extremely unique moment in history in Soviet-controlled Galicia in 1941 that Adi Walter creates his shtetl. But then, in June of 1941, Nazi Germany breaks its non-aggression pact with Soviet Russia and invades the eastern part of Poland and eventually further into the Soviet Union, and along the way destroys all the remaining Jewish towns in Galicia. In both movies, there's a similarity that we as the audience know that their world is going to come to an end, and to some extent, the characters in the stories know as well. In Fiddler on the Roof, the end comes in the form of expulsion from their towns.
In a village called Rajenka, all the Jews were evicted, forced to leave their homes.
And in Shtetl, it comes in the form of the Nazi invasion.
Menschen in andere Städte werden verschwinden, wenn keiner weiß wohin. Sagt, dass die Leute haben sie. Aber viel gehört, dass im Hot ausgelegter Städte ein paar Tage weg. Über Nacht alle jeden hat sich herausgegeppelt. Und hat sie mehr nicht gesehen. Aber viele die Polaken nehmen sie.
Despite the changing world and the dangers of history, many people in the shtetl choose to live in their world, while Mendel tries to live in two worlds. And this is addressed in the opening moments of the movie, where we hear this legend about how tradition gets eroded over time with the generations. And this also helps to underscore the point that the shtetl isn't just a place, but also a concept.
Ze veranderen automatisch wegen der Menschen so gelebt durch hier. Was vielleicht gehen sie an Ort in Wald und da tun sie nach Feier. Sucht sie nach Kurwerte und so gekannt retten sie Gott. Sein Sinn hat gekannt dem Ort und wir uns in dem Feier. Aber die Werte hat vergessen. Sein Enikel hat schon nur gekannt dem Ort, nicht wie sie in dem Feier. Und mit der Zeit habe schon die Kinder nicht gewiss von Guten. Als muss gewesen als Maße. Und als sie wissen dafür, ist schon genug.
The structure of the religion, the structure of the community is definitely what's keeping the religion and the culture alive. Because as soon as you start to mix, that starts to get diluted.
As Mendel walks through the town, he meets various people that are important to him in his life, like his father, the rabbi of the town, the tavern owner Shmulka, as well as a Talmudist named Reb Zisha. all of whom discuss this idea of being between two worlds in different ways. And what they all share in common, together with Tevye, is their fear of the loss of tradition, as well as their fight against the tides of change. And so even though some of the characters admit to these moments where they stepped out of their own world and explore the outside world, they all eventually return to the shtetl. And what they all seem to take away from this experience is that there is no middle ground. That if you don't belong in the big city with modernity, then you belong in the shtetl with tradition.
A lot of the other characters have similar dilemmas, but they're either in or they're out, you know? Like, for example, even Shmulke, you know, he left and then came back.
Ich hab gekannt bleiben wohnen dort, aber ich bin zurück, ich weiß nicht warum. Dort hab ich gar nicht gewusst. Du weißt nicht alles, Ding.
Und dein Bruder?
Mein Bruder? Ist in Paris. Ich hab ihn keinmal mehr nicht gesehen. Wie nur ist raus von Shtetl, ist kein Weg auf zurück. Hat sich im Ganzen abgesucht. Nicht wie die.
A couple of them, they have this like experimentation with the outside world, like a Rumspringa or something. Like the rabbi, for example, with his movie.
In P oder P11 bin sich weggegangen mit dem Stutt zu gehen in Kino. Ein Stimmefilm, wie hat es geheißen? Aber auch, sagt, dass ich kein Schatzpapier, aber kann ich gedenken, die verscholtene Nummer von des Films. Bürgermeister wegen einem Mensch gehodet wird von Malpes, viele gehabt, ukrainische
Tarzan.
Tarzan.
Ihr habt ihn gesehen?
Tarzan, ja, ich habe es gesehen. Aber ich soll besser wissen, weil ich habe so eine Möhre gehabt. Bin bald entlaufen. Aber zurück herein. Von Chicago's.
Although the rabbi and Mendel both experience cinema, they interpret the meaning of that experience in very different ways. The rabbi, as well as Mendel's father, see it as a force for bad, while Mendel sees potential in it for him to use his talents as a filmmaker.
He's found a way to stay connected with his roots while also leaving.
Although Perchik from Fiddler on the Roof also has a similar tension with the elders of the town, Perchik is intent on deconstructing the shtetl, society at large, while Mendel is more intent on just sharing his perspective. He wants to show them his model of the world, his ability to integrate his Jewish upbringing and his Soviet ambitions, or in other words, his ability to live between two worlds. Unlike the rabbi or his father or Shmulke, Mendel is the embodiment of the word both, and he's constantly looking for the middle ground, or the word that he uses is the Yiddish word apshude. Whenever Mendel is presented with a binary choice, he's almost incapable of choosing one side, and he always chooses both. For example, when he's asked by the rabbi if he's coming to say hi or bye, he responds with both. Or when his father asks him if he's laughing or crying, he says both. And so to extend that even further to the question of, are you one of them in the big city or are you one of us here in the shtetl, Mendel says both.
I think the reason that a lot of characters in this film are drawn to him and look up to him is because of that. How can he still be one of ours while also being in Kiev?
Unlike Mendel, who sees the world in shades of gray, his father, the rabbi, Shmulke, they all see the world in black and white. What's really interesting is that the film emphasizes this in a very subtle way, and that is that the story takes place on a Friday. And so at one point in the story, the sun goes down and it goes from being a regular weekday to being Shabbos. Once again, we're presented with this dialectic, this idea of two worlds. And this happens to be captured really well in a prayer that is said at the end of Shabbos called Havdalah, which means the separation. The prayer sanctifies God for separating light and dark, holy and profane, Israel from the nations, and Sabbath from the rest of the week. In this traditional view, there are two worlds, and God places a very harsh line in between them, to which Mendel says, both. We could see how Mendel is much more comfortable with the indefinite nature of living both, while others, like the rabbi, is very uncomfortable with it. And we see this in a moment where they're discussing doubt, or sphekus. To Mendel, what makes someone worth respecting is their ability to live in this gray area. But the rabbi makes it very clear how troubled he is by uncertainty, by sphekus. But what's really interesting is that this character, the rabbi, who is so uncomfortable with uncertainty, at one point delivers this speech about a Kabbalistic idea regarding the color gray and how it represents the truest way to see the world.
Jeden haben nur lieb das Einkulier Groi. Ja, Groi. Verwusst Groi. Der Eibischter hat angefangen mit Groi. Wann hat man schaffen die Welt. Der Emerson Groi halten sich des Heutes von Gebulle, der Sort von alle Kulieren. Alle. Es fällt auf uns durchzudringen dem Sod. Macht man es richtig, seht man Eulemes Elionim. Eulemes Elionim. Aber geht man sie weit, wird es nur Choshech. Choshech.
In cinematography, you have to balance the light, the exposure levels. If you're too white, then you don't see anything. If you're too dark, you don't see anything. So you have to find that gray in between where you can get a little bit of the highlights and shadows. Even in our black and white film, you can see worlds upon worlds, as he says.
It's really strange or interesting how the rabbi is able to intellectually understand the value of living both, but ultimately the way he lives his life is by sticking to one side of the harsh line of Havdalah.
He's so afraid of doubt, but that speech feels like a case for the middle ground, a case for mixing the highlights and the shadows.
Mendel is clearly comfortable living in the gray uncertainty, which is informed by his love of cinema, but also by his time as a Talmudic student.
Die Gemüse sagt, dass man kann sein beide, nicht nur azoi zu azoi. Drucheu darke noya, ja? Der versorgt sich für die Almunes, Yisoimim und Zekenim, hit alle Mitzvahs von der Teure.
To many in the shtetl, this idea of blurring the line of Havdalah is considered one of the greatest heresies, a corruption of the soul. And this is mentioned by a character named Folia, who is presented as Mendel's nemesis. I'm not going to focus too much on Folia in this video, particularly because I feel that the tension between Mendel and Folia isn't really ideological. I think it's more personal. I think there's just a lot of bad blood between them, and they use the religious disagreement as kind of like a pretense in order to continue their hostilities. But one thing that I will mention that's really interesting is that whenever Folia accuses people of abandoning his world and going to the other side of the line, he always compares them to being possessed by an evil spirit, like a dibuk. In case you don't know, the word dibuk means a clinging spirit, and it refers to someone who dies and because of some sin, they're not able to enter heaven, and so their soul gets trapped between heaven and earth. Or in other words, they get trapped between two worlds. What's really interesting is that the definition of a dibuk also happens to describe Mendel's existence, which is between two worlds. And so it's not a coincidence that Mendel's desire to leave the shtetl is often equated with being possessed by a dibuk. But in this context, the reference to the dibuk also sheds light on an additional layer of this story, and that is that some people in Mendel's shtetl tend to see him as having fallen from the highest of heights to the deepest of depths. The most famous example of a dibuk story is the 1937 film with that title, the subtitle of which is Tzvey Veltn, or Between Two Worlds. In that story, which also takes place in a shtetl, a young Talmudic scholar named Hanan ends up using his knowledge of Kabbalah to possess the body of his lover, Leah. However, at the end of that story, when he is exorcised, removed from Leah's body, he is not able to go into heaven, but also not able to return to his mortal body. But the true tragedy of the story of the Dybbuk, the fact that it was his use of his knowledge of Torah and Kabbalah that caused his soul to have this great fall. And so this tragedy that's captured in the story of the Dybbuk, of falling from the highest heights to the deepest depths, helps us understand how the elders of Mendel Shtetl look at his decision to pursue a career in filmmaking. His father, the rabbi, Reb Zisha, all remind Mendel about the fact that he's wasting his Gemara cup, his ability to understand and convey Talmudic concepts on filmmaking, which at best aren't as valuable as Torah study.
For him to have that potential to be a prodigy and give that up to waste his life making movies, that's tragic. Even if he becomes like the most successful filmmaker in the world, that's going to be a waste, because the only important thing is serving God and being a Rebbe.
To Mendel, who lives between two worlds, he sees tradition and modernity as having equally important functions. And although Torah and Talmud do have some value to Mendel, they aren't the be-all and end-all. And there's also value to be gained from secular pursuits like academia and filmmaking.
He rationalizes, right, that being a filmmaker in many ways is similar to being a rabbi. You're telling stories and you're trying to deliver something to the people. Mendel talks about that you can watch a film and you watch these characters wrestle with these moral dilemmas and you see yourself in them.
But to the elders of his community, this is extremely problematic, where Mendel's father refers to filmmaking as witchcraft, and as we saw with the rabbi when he's talking about doubts, this is something by which he cannot abide. But to Reb Zisha, this is even more troubling, since to him, this idea of being between two worlds is more relatable than he cares to admit. We see this in a moment where Zisha is discussing with Mendel if Stalin is truly able to appreciate the value of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses who brought the Torah down from heaven. In that conversation, you can hear how Zisha's wrestling with all of these questions, with the line that separates the two sides of Havdalah. And even though he knows which way he's supposed to lean, he's actually not so sure about it.
Because you're not allowed to ask questions. So once you start asking questions, that foundation starts to crumble. A nightmare out of Inception or something, where your whole world is starting to come down, and you have to start rebuilding brick by brick. And Mendel maybe has gotten himself to a point where he can still value those pillars of his childhood, of his life, of his culture, of his religion. But for someone who has never gotten to ask these questions before, it's a huge moment in their lives.
What's really incredible about these moments is that it underscores how this tension isn't tied to the physical place of the shtetl, but is something that continues till this day. The tension between Mendel versus his father and the rabbi, and the doubts that Reb Zisha expresses, are something that are still extremely relevant.
When I talk to a lot of Hasidim, nowadays, they feel like they can talk to me openly and maybe ask questions that they normally wouldn't be allowed to ask.
On the surface, Ari Walter, the creator of this film, who is French, shouldn't really have a lot in common with Hasidim in Brooklyn or people in a shtetl in Galicia. But the truth is, this is something I've learned from doing a lot of videos about tradition versus modernity, and that is that this theme of being between two worlds, whether it's the new versus the old, or communal pressure versus individuality, is something that applies to every single human being.
A lot of the conversations and monologues in the film are based on conversations that he had with his rabbi. It feels so specific to me.
This theme of being between two worlds is something that comes up in many, many stories, which I'm not going to mention here because this is a review of the film Shtetele after all. But one day I'm going to return and just do a super deep dive into just this topic and bring up many more examples. But this film really accurately captures this tension between two worlds and how Mendel navigates it.
But he created this character of Mendele with such specificity that he really understood the dilemmas that he's facing. That's a testament maybe to how universal it is.
In addition to this theme, which I really enjoyed exploring, there's something very special about this film, which is how they really brought a shtetl to life. And that is a result of the production, the immersion part of the cast, as well as the role of history itself.
I was part of the New Yiddish Rep production of Awake and Sing. It's a Clifford Odets play about a Jewish family in the Bronx. There was someone I worked with on that production. Her name is Moshe Lobel. She was a Yiddishist. Ended up going back to Paris, meeting Adi Walter.
Besides Yiddish theater, Moshe Lobel has played other Jewish roles, like in the opening scene of the movie The Vigil, as well as that one episode of High Maintenance that has like every Jew in it, from Lazar Twersky to the guy who played Menashe's brother-in-law.
I don't like the idea of being typecast, but I do like Jewish stories, and I do like Yiddish. This was very refreshing in the way it approached Judaism and the way that it approached these characters.
What's unique about this film is that it doesn't focus on the destruction, but rather on what was lost. This doesn't mean that the film whitewashes history, but rather it just chooses to focus on a different point, on the tensions of the lives of the people who were living during that destruction.
The people who perish, we tend to see them as like mythical beings, but actually they were people just like us who were in extraordinary circumstances. Instead of expecting them to be these perfect beings, to like look at them in the way we see ourselves in the film, and like sometimes things are uncomfortable, but we love them and we connect with them and we want them to live.
Adi Walter was inspired to create a film that captures a shtetl on its final day, but he also chose to do it as a one take, which allows us as the audience to really get immersed into this world in almost like a dreamlike state.
In reality, there are about 40 cuts in the film, 33 or 34 long shots. We had to really know what we were doing. You had to know where the camera was at any given moment. You can't go back and edit things afterwards.
Although the town in this film is fictional, what's really fascinating is the painstaking efforts that the production crew went to in order to recreate an accurate shtetl based on historic photographs.
They built the set in something like, I think, 4 or 5 weeks. This massive, shtetl center, like 25 buildings. The main houses and the synagogue were built based on tons of research photos of actual shtetls and synagogues that existed, wooden painted synagogues.
The synagogue in particular is just amazing. I remember the first time watching this film and seeing the exterior of it, it quite literally took my breath away. As a Jewish history nerd, I spend a lot of my days looking at historic photographs, and part of that is looking at synagogue architecture and interior design. And so I have to say I was really impressed by how perfectly this film captures shtetl synagogues.
And they collected like Judaica from all over Ukraine to fill the set. So even when we pass by a window in a house that we don't go into, we still see some stuff in the window, like a menorah, something that makes the world feel lived in.
As a viewer, you don't feel like you're watching a movie set, but it feels like you're watching a real place, real people. And this has to do with capturing very real themes, like the one we mentioned of being between two worlds, the historical accuracy. But there's an additional element, which is the immersion of the actors.
We get to the set, we're just like immersed in this world. You spend all day hanging out in the shtetl. I left my phone in Kyiv, and I tried to use as much Yiddish as possible. I had a journal I was writing in Yiddish. It was important to live in that world.
And on top of all of this, there's also the added effect of it being a one take, where the scenes just blend in from one to another, and the emotions just stack up on top of each other. Like one example is the discussion between Mendel and Reb Zisha, which we were talking about earlier.
But because it's filmed in one shot coming off of the cemetery scene, it's really charged with all these emotions, all this pain. And because of the emotional continuity throughout the story, where one scene informs the next, and So it's not just dialogue, it's a moment in their lives.
And when I first watched it, I have to say there were some scenes that were so emotionally intense that it kind of shocked me. I'm like, is this acting or is this real? Because it was hard to tell.
There's this moment where like a tear falls from my eye, just like the right moment. People always point that out, but that's my theater background, where the emotional progression of this scene kind of programmed into your body so that you can live it and experience it as you go through.
In particular, there's a scene right before the discussion between Mendel and Zisha where Mendel visits the grave of his mother who passed when he was a child. And there's this flashback where he sees a moment from his past with her, and then when we come back to the present, you just see Mendel completely break down and start crying over her grave, or as Moshe describes it, the emotional dam just breaks.
The preparation for that scene was really emotional. You know, getting there in the morning and seeing this child who they had made up his payas and everything, you know, to look like me when I was a kid. They cast him based on photos that I'd sent them. He really reminded me of myself, so that was like a slap in the face as soon as I arrived on the set. It was just a lot of emotions circulating, and you know, so when we started that scene, I started crying. That wasn't the hard part.
And of course, another emotional moment is the ending of the film with the Nazi invasion. And once again, this ties back to the opening of the film, this legend about the loss of tradition over many years, which not only applies to ritual tradition, but also in our retellings of the stories of the Holocaust.
Yad Vashem was recording these interviews with Holocaust survivors. But the time that I got into that project, we actually began working with the children of Holocaust survivors. I realized that that direct line to the Holocaust is starting to break. And, you know, now we have the children of, eventually it'll be the grandchildren, and eventually it'll be like some story that we knew from way back in the past.
As we move farther away from the events that are depicted in this movie, we inevitably lose sight of the details, not only of the atrocities which were perpetrated on civilians, but also on the details of their lives, which were really complicated.
Yeah, these questions which they were definitely wrestling with then and we are still wrestling with to this day, feel taken out of the current headlines. They're wearing different costumes, they're in, you know, different world, but the humanity is the same. Cultural dilemmas that they deal with are still ongoing.
But there's one more element which we haven't mentioned yet, that both the production crew of this film and the actual characters in this story share in common, and that is the threat of war on one's doorstep.
We started in February of 2021, and we were going to start filming in July. But the cinematographer was already on a computer mapping out where the camera was going to go, because they had to build the set based on the camera movements and the flow of the story. And Putin surrounded Ukraine with like 100,000 troops in May or April of 2021. There was a moment where like we weren't sure if we can make this movie. We thought war can break out at any moment.
Like in Fiddler on the Roof with the threat of expulsion, or in Shtetl with the threat of the Nazis, in the case of the production of this film, there was the threat of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But despite the fact that many people intuited its inevitability, in all three cases, it seems like people just went about their everyday business out of powerlessness to do anything about it.
The whole world was watching and waiting for Russia to invade, but in Ukraine, people were just going about their business. There could be missiles, you know, pointed in your direction. There could be all this going on, a line of tanks at the border, but you're not going to believe it until the first explosion, the first gunshot. And that's what we see in the film. That was the extraordinary thing about making a film about like the eve of war, during the eve of war, because you realize as much as you know, you still go on with your life. You still can't believe it's gonna happen here in my world, in my city. No, that's something that happens like over there.
The real power of Synchronicity is that it shows us how the themes from the past are still relevant today, whether it's the spiritual themes we started with, or war, or anti-Semitism. It allows us as the audience to gain perspective on our moment that we're living through.
One of the last days of filming, one of the costumers taught me this phrase, Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. I couldn't have imagined that like 6 months later, the whole world would be saying this phrase on TV.
Ukraine's capital city of Kyiv is under attack as Russian troops continue their assault on the country. Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky is also vowing to stay in the capital. But many Ukrainians are trying to leave. More than 100,000 have already crossed the border into Poland.
Slava Ukraina. Glory to heroes.
Felt so important and extraordinary to get an opportunity to explore this history in Ukraine. Judaism in Ukraine used to be so prominent. It was just a huge part of the fabric of civilization there. That reality was important to show. Along with Ukrainian culture, there's really that feeling of like something was robbed from us.
In the meantime, the set that was constructed for this movie was abandoned at the start of the war in February of 2022.
Sometime in March, they had to coordinate with the government to disable the air defense so they could fly a drone, and then we saw that the set was still intact. So it is still there, it's still standing. I hope it will survive. You know, it gets every year, obviously it gets weather worn, but I don't know how long it'll be before we can actually turn it into a museum.
Until this conflict is resolved, the future of the shtetl, like that of Ukraine, remains uncertain.
The plan was to turn it into a museum because it is an extraordinary place, it's an extraordinary set. You could just walk in and go into these houses, into the synagogue, and you know, so I guess they would do some kind of tours showing what shtetl life was in Ukraine.
The theme of synchronicity stretches from the theme of war all the way back to the theme we started with, which is the details of Mendel's character. And that is a Talmudic student from an insular world who takes an opportunity to go to the big city and pursue a career in filmmaking. A theme which, for many of us, remains relevant to this day.
Hasidim come in like, you know, baseball caps. Actually, there was one kid who came a few weeks ago, a 17-year-old kid wearing a baseball cap, a little beard, and he comes up to me after, he starts talking to me about the different Yiddishes. I asked, how did you hear about this movie? He said, I want to be a filmmaker. I want to be a cinematographer, and I heard about the film and I wanted to come see it. And that was crazy to me because that is literally my character in the film.
So I want to thank Moshe Lobel for joining us in this in-depth discussion, which hopefully will give you a much better appreciation for the different viewpoints in this movie, how they clash, and how Mendel navigates through all of it. If you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly encourage you to go check it out. Eventually, it's going to be streaming online, but as of now, it's doing a theatrical run. There is a benefit to seeing this movie in a theater, and that is the bigger screen and the sound design make it much more immersive. But there's also something to experiencing this movie with other people.
We've been playing at the New Plaza Cinema on the Upper West Side in New York. This is like our home base, has been our home base, but we will come back in LA actually, probably sometime in January or February. We are opening in Florida in January. We are opening in Boston, DC, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. You can go to shtetl.info, SHTTL.info. I'm doing Q&As, some of them. I'm going to the ones in New York as often as possible. Stay tuned, check out the website.
In the meantime, if you're someone who's interested in Jewish history, culture, and art, then you, my friend, you're in the right place. My name is David, and welcome to Yiddishkeit.